But I'm going to go through some of the more recent things related to funding and what we've worked on. So obviously, I get to present to you, but we've had a host of students all the way back to Dirk Birkin, Henry who's here, Lauren who's here, Colton who's graduated, McKenna who's collecting data in Lincoln, Cassandra Roll who's graduated with a master's, and then some support technicians and stuff. Why do I put that up there? Because we've been interested in silage, which is why it's been a fit for us to host a silage conference the last couple years, but it's primarily from industry funding, okay? And that industry funding is what is providing support for us to train graduate students. So Henry's leaving if he passes in a couple weeks and has a job lined up. Dirk's a nutritionist in Canada, and the rest are hoping to become employed when they get done. So I think everybody understands how this works, but really it's graduate students who do the work, and the funding that's provided for these types of projects is really what allows us to train students. And obviously a lot of this discussions happen with Terry and Jim and Andrea and a group of us who work closely together. A few of these, now I also put that up there so that when Henry sees a bunch of slides that he made and I'm using them, I just gave him credit, okay? So if I stole any slides, it was probably from students. So this one happens to be Henry's. You know, we've talked about silage composition, so I'm not going to talk about it, but we have been working in that area and looking at what are ways we can manipulate that nutrition and what's the effect of that on performance. So the outline, this is not the outline I'm going to talk about for today, but for those that didn't happen to be here in 2016, this is what I discussed in 2016. And you'll see how that's different than maybe today. Some of those things I'm not going to rehash. And so if you weren't here in 2016 and you want to learn about it, all you got to do is visit it on our website. It's also on the Iowa Beef Center. It's also on Lallamand's site. And every single talk from that day was recorded just like today. And just like today, these will be available, Erin, maybe in a couple weeks. She posts them, so I got to ask her whenever they're going to be available. So I talked about impact of inclusion, silage and distillers, different hybrid issues, kernel processing, but we didn't have any beef data to share at that time. We do today. A little bit about harvest dry matter and then drought. Today I'm going to focus primarily on 4 things. And that's why I wasn't too worried about our schedule, because for once everybody's going to be relieved. I'm going to probably go shorter than the time that I was allotted. Because I'm going to focus in on these 4 things, because we've talked a lot about silage already and issues that are all good. So I want to give you a summary of what we're looking at. As Alan Statler alluded to earlier, I am going to talk a little bit about a different approach than the traditional approach of feeding 15% silage. And we're going to talk about that because we think it's economical. That's what Terry's going to potentially show later. I'm going to talk about what's the impact on performance in a summarized manner. I'm also going to share something really interesting that Lauren completed, where we actually grew cattle and then finished them compared to just finishing them directly. And I'll explain why we did that. I'm going to talk some about BMR, the work that we've done that's recently. We've got some excellent data, I think, on kernel processing and growing and finishing, and then I'll end a little bit on harvest maturity. Okay. I bring this up again because Goodrich, and people know this, had a nice summary years and years ago and showed what's the impact as I increase silage inclusion in the diet on gain, intake, and feed conversion. I brought this table up because I want you to primarily look at the 10% versus the 40. And there's about a 13% poorer feed conversion as I go from 10% silage to 40% silage. But the math and the economics they did then was that it was still economical. So keep that 12.9% in mind. In 2000, when I was in school, we actually fed 15, 30, and 45% silage. That's why I showed you the 10 and 40 from the Goodrich, because I'm going to spend a lot of time talking about 15 and 45. And so I just want to show that in these diets that we did in 2000, there were no byproducts in the diet, and there was an 11% poor feed conversion when I go from 15 to 45. You will notice, this is when statistics matter. Most times they May not be that important to many of the producers and maybe even some consultants, but statistics do matter. These were quadratic responses. What does that mean? That means that average daily gain got worse when I went from 15 to 30%, but it didn't keep getting the same amount worse when I go from 30 to 45. That's the quadratic response. Does that make sense? So you get hurt going from 15 to 30, but you don't get hurt as much if you go additionally from 30 to 45. That's why quadratic response matters there. Same thing with feed conversion. And then Dirk Birkin, in his program, looked at diets with modified distillers grains in the diet. In those diets, I believe there was 30% modified distillers, and then he fed 15, 30, 45, and 55% silage. Actually, it was 40% distillers. So this diet here had no corn. It's 40% distillers grains, 55% silage, 5% supplement. So his line, and I apologize, this is gain to feed, so the bigger the number, the better. As he increased silage in the diet, you can see gain to feed got worse. And then if you look at what my study showed without but distillers grains, gain to feed didn't get, or got more dramatically worse as you go from 15 to 45. Same idea as what Andrew was showing when she said, look, as we add distillers grains, silage, going higher silage doesn't seem as bad. Now, for many consultants that are here and producers, no one seems to want to buy distillers anymore. I think that'll change in the next few weeks as it gets cheaper. But there's this antagonism between buying distillers and using distillers, which I'm concerned about. Now, I can say whatever I want and show you all the data, but people don't want to buy distillers. And that's fine. But you can't ignore that there is some real intrinsic benefits of having distillers, especially if you're going to talk about high silage diets. Okay, so what's in your proceedings is a summary of 58 pens of data, 5 experiments. Pretty good for replication as far as we can do here. I'm fairly confident that as I go from 15 to 45% silage, you'll see about a 0.2 pounds per day decrease in average daily gain, and feed conversion is going to get 6.7% worse. That's what this is. The caution's not for that. I'll explain the caution in a second. So conversions are 6.3% worse. 6.7% worse, whereas you remember that data that without distillers, we were talking about 10, 11, 12% worse. So that just illustrates that point some more. Now, this was Galen Erickson's meta-analysis, not Jim McDonald's meta-analysis. His would be correct, mine's just comparing the means. Now, what do I mean by that? I put up carcass weight, and then I put a word there saying caution. One of those studies that I'm going to show you today, we fed the cattle longer, which made them even heavier when I fed more silage, which I'll explain in a minute. So I don't want you to look at this carcass weight and say, well, how can you decrease average daily gain and not decrease carcass weight? In every study that were fed the same days, if I decreased average daily gain, we sold lighter cattle, right? That's just the way it works. I understand that's how it works. One of those studies, we fed them longer. So the one I want you to look at is average daily gain, not carcass weight, because I'm going to show you that study later. In fact, if I was smart, I would have just not showed it to you. But I wanted to explain in case you ever see that. So we think distillers inclusion is really important. So Dirk Birkin went in and we fed 15% silage and 45% silage in diets with 20 distillers. And then we did the same thing in diets, 15 and 45 silage, and diets with 40% distillers. The mistake we made is that we don't have a 0% distillers. We did it twice, and in one study there was an interaction. In this study there was not. There's about a 5% increase in feed conversion in 20% distillers going from 15 to 45, and about a 5.5% worse feed conversion as I go from 15 to 45% silage with 40% distillers. But everybody I know today that's feeding distillers still don't want to go above 20% inclusion. Now, the other thing is, which the consultants know today, all of these percentages I'm talking about are on a dry matter basis, not on an as-fed. Because that's the other challenge that happens, is I know many producers say, well, I listened to you, I went home and I started feeding 30% distillers because that's what you said. That was 30% as fed that they went home and did. I was talking about 30% dry matter. With wet distillers grains, 30% on a dry matter basis in most diets is somewhere around 45 to 50% inclusion. So it matters, and silage it matters too, because silage is a wet ingredient. You got to think about nutritionally what is the inclusion on a dry matter basis. Worry about later what you're going to weigh out in the feed truck and getting that part converted correctly. So all these percentages today are dry matter. So 45% inclusion of silage on a dry matter basis is a lot of silage on an as-fed basis. Just to be crystal clear. Okay, now for Lauren's study. This was a study that we did with mycogen. And so we have the hybrids, and I'm going to talk about BMR here in a second. But for this part, there was no interaction with hybrids, so I'm just showing you the effect of what we did in terms of silage inclusion. In this study, Lauren fed, this is days on feed, and this is fat thickness. And we used ultrasound to assess fat thickness of those different silage inclusions. So on day 70, she measured fat thickness for cattle fed 15% silage, 45% silage, and 75% silage. And the cattle that had been only on 15% silage were fatter than the ones fed more silage, which makes some sense, right? And then she ultrasounded them again at day 126, and the 15% silage diets, more corn, were fatter than the 45, which were fatter than the 75. And I'll explain here in a minute what the 75 is. So what we were trying to do is we were trying to then slaughter these cattle right here on day 153, and then based on how these guys were looking ultrasound, we fed the other two levels of silage 4 weeks longer. Does everybody understand why we did that? We were trying, if you're going to feed them high silage and they're leaner, you can feed them longer to make them the same fatness. You understand the logic? All those previous studies were same days on feed, not to the same fatness always. So, Lauren messed it all up. Isn't that what we concluded? No. What happened? The 15% silage group cattle didn't keep going like they were supposed to. When we went and slaughtered them, they had slowed down their fattening rate, so they ended up being a little bit less than the ones we fed 4 weeks longer. Anybody wants to get that right, we'd be happy to have you fund the study and do it, because it's pretty tough work. So you can criticize it all you want, but that was our attempt. Okay, so how do those data look? To be crystal clear again, cattle fed 15% silage were fed 153 days. Cattle fed 45% silage were fed 181 days. I just explained the logic for why did we feed them longer. Now, this treatment on the far right, I haven't explained. Dave or others that are consultants, how many of them do you think have listened to us when I keep saying, instead of feeding 15% silage, feed 45? How many people do you think have listened to me in the state of Nebraska? 0. It's my estimate anyway. I shouldn't say this because my boss is here, because now you're going to think I don't have any impact. Nobody's listening to it. So they don't believe us, don't think it's economical, whatever. But you know what's interesting is a lot of producers and a lot of consultants like feeding a silage growing diet to them for the first part and then step them up onto a high grain diet. So guess what the average silage inclusion is if you feed 75% silage for the first half and 15% silage for the second half? Is anybody good at math? 45. So I'm tricking you, right? So our first question was, what happens when you feed these guys longer to get them to the same fatness? Second question was, do you get the same performance if you feed 45 all the way through as if you feed 75 the first half, 15 the second half? Is that clear? I thought it was, well, I still think it's ingenious. Study design? I'll let you debate that. Okay, so what happened? Cattle fed more silage gained less per day. 3.8, 3.7, those are not statistically different. Conversions, 5.9, 6.2, 6.2. You don't need statistics to know the 6.17 are not different from one another, right? You get same conversion, probably exactly the same gain too, if you feed 75% for the first half, 15% for the second half, as if you just feed 45 all the way through. So if you don't like feeding 45 all the way through, just do it like you always have, feed a lot of silage up front, less at the end. Because you're going to get the same effect that I want you to get, which is more money. Now, the other thing that's interesting, which I think Ron, I don't know if Ron's still here, Soulful. Yeah, someone, I think it was you, commented about this when I was sharing it in West Point. But if you grew them on silage, you got to actually make them bigger. And there's one thing Nebraska likes is to make cattle bigger before they get too fat. Does that make sense? So that's another thing to think about. So these carcass weights are greater, but don't forget they had 28 more days on feed. Okay, Henry's work, looking at the BMR hybrid. BMR, everybody's familiar with, is lower lignin hybrids. It does improve fiber digestibility. Well, if you're feeding 15%, we didn't know what the effect of that BMR might be, so we fed a control hybrid from Mycogen in this case, BMR, and then an experimental BMR hybrid that has a different kernel characteristics, the Silage kernel characteristic. And at 15% inclusion, interestingly, that new hybrid, or the experimental one, actually had a little higher gain. But what was intriguing to me is that at 45% inclusion, notice the control gain fell off, which is what we've seen in all those experiments. What's intriguing to me is that the gain didn't fall off as much. So if you are going to feed a lot of silage, now these silage hybrids, I think, become even more important. BMR is the example here, just to improve that gain. Feed conversion, same concept. Some noise at 15%. The experimental hybrid was significantly better than the regular BMR, and conversions, at least for the regular BMR, was improved at the 45% inclusion level. That's not necessarily news. Keith and others, this is a bit of a complicated study in that this diet here has corn silage, only corn silage. This is corn silage plus corn fed at 1% of body weight, corn silage plus corn fed at 2% of body weight. In other words, the way to look at this is straight corn silage, half corn silage, or a little bit less, 15% corn silage as an estimate. And if you have more silage in the diet, there's greater opportunity for the BMR to improve performance as compared to if you don't have much silage. So if you're gonna feed a silage that's better, it's going to be harder to see much difference if you only feed 15%. This is a study that Lauren did. This is all these hybrids were fed at 40% of the diet. So this is finishing cattle, but this is a control hybrid fed at 40% inclusion, gains of 412, conversion of 7.6. These were yearlings. The BMR hybrid from Mycogen, gain of 4.5, so more, and feed conversions improved. And the experimental BMR hybrid, gain of 4.5, conversions improved. So again, that's with 40% inclusion silage. So if you're going to feed 40% silage, pay attention to the silage characteristics, especially from a hybrid perspective. Same thing holds true in growing performance. This is some work from Henry. These are growing cattle, and I purposely wanted to show this because I want you to understand what happens in a growing diet versus what happens in a finishing diet. There's a lot of graduate students here. Does anybody want me to pick on them? Maybe I should pick on some recent graduates, Jordan, Robert. What limits intake in a high-grain diet? Energy. The more energy in the high-grain diet, the less the cattle eat on a finishing diet. What limits intake in a high-forage diet, like a silage grower? Gut fill. What limits gut fill is in a high-forage diet is how digestible the fiber is, and it is influenced by passage rate. So if you increase the digestibility of the forage, you increase passage rate, you can increase intake. So this is about as typical of a forage digestibility response as you can get. Cattle fed the 2 BMR hybrids ate more feed as compared to the corn in diets with an 80% silage. Actually, this was 88% silage. And they gained more because they ate more, but they were not more efficient in this case. So if gut fill's limiting intake, like in a silage grower, and you feed a silage that's improved fiber digestibility, they'll eat more, gain more, be more efficient. I forgot who asked the question, but back to the question that was asked of Andrea is if I improve, what if I limit feed it? Adam, you think you asked that, right? Then you won't get more gain, or you won't get more intake because you're limit feeding them. Should get more gain and improved feed conversion in that case, theoretically. That would be an interesting test. Also have improved fiber digestibility in the data that we have, so you can see that. Okay, this third topic I wanted to touch on was kernel processing. This is, again, a study that was sponsored by Mycogen as part of the silage hybrid work. 18 pens per treatment. And the reason there's 18 pens per treatment is because kernel processing did not interact with those BMR hybrids. So this is the main effect, if you will, of kernel processing. And as far as I know, at least that I'm aware of, there's some work that's from about 15 to 20 years ago on kernel processing out of Kansas State, and nothing else that's more recent than 20 years old. Not a lot of work on kernel processing. And what did Russ show? 72% of the producers in Iowa were feeding kernel processed corn silage. Why? There was no data. Why are they doing it? Well, because the dairy industry did it, right? I don't know if that's a good reason, though. But turns out you improve feed efficiency. In this case, I'll let you decide if that's significant. I think it is. The p-value is 0.1. It was a 2.9% improvement in feed conversion when silage was included at 40% of the diet. The only difference between those two diets is 40% silage in the diet that was either kernel processed or not. So if the cattle did 2.9% different, we calculate 2.9 divided by 0.4 that the silage is probably 7.2% better if you kernel process. That needs to be further confirmed. So we did, and this is a different study that McKenna Brinton's done. It's not published. So this one is not in the proceedings, but she had diets that were 80% silage, 16 pens per treatment, no kernel processing, with kernel processing. Now with 80% silage, she saw a significant improvement in feed conversion. It was 5.2%, which calculates to about 6.5% improvement. So if you ask me the question, I think kernel processing improves silage 6.5 to 7% based on those two studies. Okay, we talked some about harvest moisture. I'm going to go through this quickly because this was presented 2 years ago, and we haven't done any follow-up work, but I am intrigued by when should we harvest silage. It is not easy to look at a cornfield and know what the moisture is going to be of the silage. And I think that would be great to come up with some way to chop some and be able to test moisture right away and be accurate. But we've been interested in putting up some drier silage because as you get closer to black layer, right here is black layer. This is 1 week prior, 2 weeks prior, 3 weeks prior, et cetera, from black layer. As you get closer to black layer, percent grain increases and continues to increase past black layer. The reason it's increasing past black layers because the fiber and the stover part is disappearing. The reason it's increasing up till black layers because the plant's putting down grain. Well, the silage dry matter was in the low 30s, and then got up to the upper 30s and low 40s at black layer, and then obviously dries down as you get closer to dry corn harvest. So we were interested in comparing something like this to something like this, harvested 2 weeks before, to see what does typical silage harvest look like compared to something at black layer, because it would have more grain in it. So back up. NDF digestibility looks pretty good, right? If you look at, this is based on some lab techniques for NDF digestibility. Digestibility's in the 60s. Then once you get out here, especially closer to dry corn harvest, fiber digestibility falls apart, primarily because a lot of things are happening in that stover, presumably. Dr. Owens and others have talked a lot about that. Okay, we compared then silage that was put up at 37% dry matter or 43% dry matter. If you think about it in moisture, I can do the math for you, that's 63 and 57, okay? however you look at it, either lower moisture compared to conventional or higher dry matter, same thing. If you look at those compositionally, notice that the fiber's lower in the drier silage and the starch is higher, which is exactly what you would expect. What about performance? Henry did this work where he fed 15% silage or 45% silage that was either normal silage or drier, and no difference in gain, no difference in feed conversion if it was fed at 15%, no difference in gain, no difference in feed conversion if it was fed at 45%. So we should have stopped there, but Henry wanted to do another study, so he did it in growing cattle. And with growing cattle, the drier silage had lower gain and poorer feed conversions. So it's a little bit perplexing, but with finishing cattle, it appeared the moisture didn't matter. If it was between 37 and 43, with growing cattle, it hurt performance. He did a lamb digestibility study, and the fiber digestibility was hurt if the silage was drier. Why wasn't organic matter digestibility worse if fiber digestibility was? There was more grain in that drier silage, and so it improved dry matter digestibility, but not fiber. Okay, the last comment before we wrap up is shrink, and that's been discussed. Great sessions this morning on how to put up silage. Hopefully lots of advice that you can either share with clients or as producers follow yourselves and think about. But I got to share with you that I'm a little worried about if you're going to go home and measure shrink and see how you can improve. I've talked to some producers that I don't think are measuring it correctly. And so I want to just make sure we're all on the same page. Shrink, by my definition, is dry matter in, dry matter out. If you don't account for it, you're either going to run out of silage before you thought, or you're undercharging that cost to the cattle. Does that make sense? So you got to account for it, but we got to account for it correctly. Now, a lot of people pick on silage for shrink, and there's no doubt we need to do all the things discussed this morning to manage shrink. But every single forage shrinks. Hay may be the worst. We don't talk about shrink in hay, though. When people talk about the attributes of hay, they never talk about shrink. Talk about silage, first thing come out of people's mouths, shrink. Doesn't make sense to me. But anyway, so minimize shrink, that's been discussed. Okay, so measuring dry matter in and dry matter out. I think we do a good job of measuring dry matter out of the bunkers because people take samples, they're weighing that feed out of the bunker, et cetera. It's hard to measure that going in. Either we don't sample it at harvest time, or we do sample it, but we just count the number of loads coming in and maybe estimate those load weights, right? You got to measure as is weighed in accurately. I'm not saying you got to measure every load, but you got to measure it accurately going in and take samples and measure the moisture content. I think we do okay coming out. The reason I bring that up is because if you just measure the weight in that's as is and the weight out as is, you've dramatically underestimated. I think dramatically underestimated shrink. And that's where I think some producers have measured shrink. I'm going to give you an example. If I need 10,000 tons of silage as is, and I put it up at 37% dry matter, it's 3,700 tons of dry matter. Everybody follow that? If 12% of the dry matter is lost, I just made that number up, I'm assuming that, I only have 3,256 tons of dry matter coming out. Does everybody follow my logic? But you know what happens, and you should test this, when I put silage into the bunker, and then I measure it after fermentation and months later, it comes out wetter. Some of that's because of loss. Hopefully that's not because of volatiles and incorrect dry matter estimates, but that needs to be challenged and make sure that that's correct. We've seen as much as a 1 percentage unit change, so if I put up 37% dry matter silage, probably going to be feeding something that's 36% dry matter the rest of the time, or maybe get wetter over time. So my point is, if I just say 10,000 tons in, 9,000 tons out, I come up with a shrink of 9.5%. If I do it on a dry matter basis, it was 12%. So I'm just cautioning you that if silage does get wetter in the bunker, as is shrink is not the same as dry matter. Okay, to wrap up then, feeding 45% silage instead of 15% does reduce gain, and it does hurt feed conversion. And as Alan alluded to, I thought it was excellent this morning. He's exactly right. Feedlot's focus have been conversion and cost of gain. I would argue feedlots' focus have been conversion. My focus is really on cost of gain and profitability. So how we price silage matters a lot. And I think it's economical. You'll have to stay around for Terry's talk to show what we're thinking. If you don't want to adopt that process, but you're okay with feeding 75% up front and 15% for the second half, that's great. I think you can make them bigger to get them to the same fatness, but you're going to get the same performance as if you just feed 45% continuously. Certainly, hybrids like the BMR hybrid that we've tested, and there's going to be other things coming from us and others, that can improve your intake and gain if it's a growing diet because they can eat more, or it improves gain and feed conversion if you feed it at these elevated levels in finishing diets. Kernel processing, our best estimate is 6.5 to 7.25% improvement due to kernel processing, but you won't see that kind of improvement unless you're feeding 100% silage, which if you listen to Andrea's talk, you'd never feed 100% silage because you're not going to have the right kind of protein. You see my point? So what kind of improvement you see in feed efficiency will depend on what your inclusion of silage is. You need to have this RUP thing in mind. Obviously today, that's distillers grains. That could be other things in the future. And drier silage may or may not hurt things. It probably does decrease digestible fiber. But it does influence the economics some, which we're working on. And then measure shrink. I think that's all I have. So I'll be happy to answer questions if there are any. Otherwise, we can go to our last topic for the day. Is there any questions? Yes?
Do you see any difference in metabolic disorders in your higher silage?
Okay, the question was, do we see any difference in metabolic disorders in our higher silage diets? Of course, as Alan knows, we don't have any metabolic disorder in our research feedlot. No, I'm joking, obviously, right? It is difficult, though, in all seriousness, it is difficult in our research settings to measure those types of applications in commercial settings of acidosis, metabolic challenges. We do see a numerical decrease in liver abscesses, which would maybe be one indication. We have some research funding from the Iowa Beef Council for this coming year, and that's exactly what we're going to test with a more commercially acceptable approach to get to that. So there's no doubt it's got to be easier, but it's not been quantified necessarily.
Galen, there's some concern with these high silage diets that we don't have enough dry matter in wintertime feeding.
Yeah.
What would you say to that?
It's a good question to discuss. These diets, even if you put up silage at 35% dry matter, from an intake perspective and the cattle perspective, it doesn't limit intake. There are two concerns, especially if you're feeding cattle in the north. With wetter diets, could be obviously freezing in the winter. To be honest, it's also spoilage in the summer. So there's no doubt, and I recognize that there are management challenges with feeding wet diets. You also got to haul more weight, as is. So I'm not trying to make fun or light of any of those challenges. Obviously, we don't see those kind of problems in our study. I don't think moisture per se, though, at 35% dry matter diet even, if it was just straight silage, moisture limits intake. I think many people say, well, if I fed wetter silage, they ate less. Well, that's because it was more fermentable. If I feed wetter, high moisture corn, they eat less. That's true, but that's because it's more prone to acidosis and acid production in the rumen. You see, so I think wetter diets can be more prone to acid production, if you will, in the rumen, but I don't think that the moisture is the challenge. The best evidence for that, of course, that we use here is if you want to see our cattle in May out on brome grass pastures, they're eating a diet that's probably 20-25% dry matter. They're not limited on intake. They're fitting as much in as they can fit in on a dry basis. And you never want to stand behind those when you're working those cattle, right? But they don't have an intake problem from moisture. The rumen contents are 15 to 20%, 15% dry matter. So we think until you get above 85% water, you probably wouldn't truly limit water, intake. Plus, they're all drinking water, even on silage growing diets. So it's not water per se, but there are management issues to take into account. If you're the person with the operation, you'll have to haul more feed. You'll have to worry about freezing and spoilage and stuff. So, Mark?
The thing that I think he alluded to, and I have been asked multiple times, is cattle being able to stay warm.
Yeah.
Actual cattle staying warm with that wet of a diet.
Yeah, that's a fair question. How does the moisture of the diet interact with risk and stress on the environment? I don't know the answer to that. I would think very little. Otherwise, they'd be cooler in the summer, and I don't know if that happens either.
Don't they just drink less water?
Yeah, they do just drink less water, but we've not measured any of that stuff. You know, that would require some measurement to prove or disprove. The performance is obviously what we're measuring.
So going back to your comment about harvest moisture and trying to predict optimum harvest time, have you ever looked at what I believe it was Bill Cox was doing a few years back at Cornell when he started tracking bee units from pollination forward, that he thought it was pretty consistent across hybrid? I believe early versus late there was a slight difference, but they were all pretty predictable. He did a couple 3-year study. I don't know if they're still doing it at all out there or not, but have you looked at that?
The question was, is there are other ways, maybe one way being done in Pennsylvania is heat units from pollination and like growing degree day type measurement from pollination. That's the kind of thing I mean is that I haven't, so your question was if I looked at it, the answer is no, but that's a great idea or other, that's what I'm interested in is innovative ideas for us to give advice that's better besides looking out there and even just milk line, because that can vary. We just, if we're going to promote silage, we need to account for all these management things. And I think one of the biggest management risks is when should you cut it? And then again, there's a lot of variation, as you saw from the Iowa survey and others that have sent in. Alan showed it from Dairyland, I think it was. Tremendous variation in what producers put up. Sometimes, and that's just simply when can the custom operator come through your county? And I don't know if that's necessarily the best either, but that's a challenge. So I'm interested in being able to give producers better ways to figure out when to cut silage, but most importantly, what is that optimum dry matter? I know from Dr. Owens' Midwest talk a couple years ago at least, and I think some of that was dairy data, 37% from what I remember, dry matter was the optimum dry matter. And our data, that's why we had 37% in there. But that's fine. My point was, how do you go out then and implement that in production and tell a producer, oh yeah, cut that field when it's 37% dry matter. If I'm the producer, I'd say, tell me when that is.
I think the stay green characteristics of the plant is an important factor. Dry matter content may vary all over the place, but if it doesn't have a green, healthy stock, I'm concerned about the fiber.
Yes. So Dr. Owens' comment was they call it stay green technology now, where the plant's still respiring, growing, even later and later and later in the growing season, past black layer and so on. And so that interacts with this issue of, and all of you that produce corn know that. You have corn that dries down different ways. It gets complicated. We need to sort all that out if people are going to put up more silage. But when I see Nebraska's ranked 10th, and we have a lot of beef cattle, and we think it's the cheapest source of energy currently available today, or at least competitive with distillers, that's why we'd like to see people put up more silage. It's pretty straightforward. One more question.
You talked about BMR silage. We've all heard of Inogen for the alcohol plants.
Yep.
I've heard something about high moisture corn being way more efficient, corn silage being way more efficient. So I believe the Inogen.
Bless you. Yeah, so your question is, how's the Inogen factor into this?
Are you guys looking into that?
So the question is there's other hybrid things to test related to silage. All I was showing was BMR. Your question specifically is now on Inogen. I can't release anything yet, but yes, to answer your question, there'll be things coming soon on feeding Inogen as silage. And but you also commented that Inogen is how much corn's better. Our data says the opposite. The best way, if you're gonna grow and feed Inogen corn, it would be as dry rolled corn. That's what our data would say. Not as high moisture corn. We didn't see an effect. But I guess my point is certainly not to promote or demote any hybrids other than if you're going to feed a lot of silage, now you should start looking at that whole gamut again. And I think there'll be renewed interest in how do we make hybrids that might be better silage. But yield's keying, and we're still going to plant corn that yields a lot of grain. That's still our number one goal. Okay, we better stop there. I'm obviously going to be around.